Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of All the Good Men. Today we have Soma Miller on with us, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Soma Miller is a father, a transformational men's coach, and a visionary at the forefront of redefining modern masculinity. And in the work that he does, he fuses shadow work, somatic practices, indigenous wisdom, relational mastery, and he guides men, supports men to align with their deepest values, creating secure, sexy intimacy and a life fueled by purpose and impact. Devoted to fostering emotionally mature and empowered masculinity, Soma is passionate about helping men break through societal conditioning to live authentically, connect deeply, lead with integrity. And through his East meets West approach, Soma is shaping a new paradigm of what it means to be a man in today's world. Soma, it is so good to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so great to have this conversation and to meet you.
Likewise, really glad to be here.
As I just have explored your work a little bit and then also read your bio and your what you have sent me about yourself, I am feeling so inspired in terms of your approach to how you talk about masculinity, to the ways that you guide men, to the ways that you really see this in what appears to me as a very holistic way. And when reading about you, hearing shadow work, somatic practices, indigenous wisdom, relational mastery, these are essentially what I've built my life and work around. So I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
Hmm.
And the first thing that I wanted to ask you is about what you mean specifically within the context of your own work by East meets West approach. So I'm curious what that looks like in your own work, in your own methodology, and what brought you to that approach. Why is that the approach that you have? What in your life has brought you to that way of working?
Yeah, I've been a yogi for a couple of decades now, plus. So just that influence in my life is, that's been one of my most transformational practices that I've discovered, fortunately, in my early 20s. And obviously, we have a very westernized form of yoga that many of us practice these days. But can't ignore the beautiful traditions that have been developed for thousands of years and passed on through the lineages. And so yeah, I mean that's a large part of my background and influence. A lot of my work is rooted in like the yogic traditions. I feel like that's such a foundation for, particularly for men, to getting to know themselves on so many different levels. And I can go deep into that, but I just want to tie that into how that meets the West. I mean, obviously, I'm born in the West, and so my culture as a white male is largely influenced by kind of European traditions, and namely like psychology, and also what I've delved into a lot more recently is like the neuroscience of like how the nervous system works. And this is kind of a burgeoning field. More and more there's just more research being done on particularly how these Eastern methodologies work, and just putting the pieces together of like what is out there esoteric stuff that is not really grounded in anything, and then what's actually like tried and tested and verifiable and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. This is something that I love about being alive in this day and age is how much ancient wisdom traditions are just being consistently proven true through the research behind modern day science. It's incredible to see all of these things that were quote unquote unseen. These unseen ways of perceiving the world are being, and I'll say quote unquote proven, right? Because it's all through the context of what we see as being proof, but
Yeah.
things are being scientifically proven to hold a sort of like physical, practical truth that
Hmm.
now brings this recognition to traditions, to practices, to understandings of the world that have existed for thousands of years.
Yeah, yeah, and it's helpful because we are a a culture that's very like rooted in what works, and the mind wants to know, and belief itself is so powerful, right? Like we look at the placebo effect, right? So particularly when you're dealing with, I think men in general orient towards like, the things that we can track and the things that we can quantify. And so having that lens is also helpful to kind of get that buy-in from men that might also be more skeptical, resistant to, these practices that some might deem kind of woo-woo or out there, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
mhm,
Absolutely. I always, with the men that I work with, I always like to give an explanation of here's why we're doing this. Here
mhm,
are the here's the impact that the intended impact of this practice. Here's
mhm.
why it works on both a physical, practical level and then also on a more subtle, energetic level. Here's the whole reasoning behind it. And I find that that helps so many men to be like, okay, I know why I'm doing this, which
Hmm.
helps with the actual dedication to wanting to do the practice in the first place. And then that, of course, then leads to the results, the intended results of the practice. It's so helpful to have those that backing to explain what it is that we're doing and
Yeah,
why.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you also have worked with indigenous wisdom traditions in certain aspects, and I'm curious to hear more about what your background in that has been and the ways that that has also influenced your understanding of masculinity, your approach to studying and working with masculinity. I've
Hmm.
found that in so many indigenous wisdom traditions, there is an emphasis on remembering a more natural way of living, both natural with nature and also natural with ourselves, living in accordance to a deeper truth within our nervous systems, our bodies, our minds, our surroundings, and personally working with and learning from members of indigenous tribes and communities has been a massive catalyst in my process around knowing myself as a woman, what that truly means to me in the context of my existence in the natural world and my existence in the modern day world. And so I'm really curious to hear about what your past has looked like within those studies, within that work, and how that has influenced your work around masculinity.
Just to kind of piggyback on what you were speaking to, I think my like the constitution of my own soul naturally led me to have kind of an affinity towards kind of being blown open by the beauty of nature from pretty early age.
Yeah.
And I think the truth is we're all indigenous to this earth, right? Like we're all of this earth. We are biologically designed to be in relationship to our environments, and that's through our senses, and most indigenous traditions had some sense of place in terms of like how they create their system of belonging to not just to like tribe, but to an actual like watershed, right? Like
Mm.
all the physicalities of the environment that nurture them in all these ways create this what some should seem like an obvious kind of reciprocity of awareness of how we are interconnected. And I think I in some ways stumbled upon that realization pretty early in life just through my own experiences. I think psychedelics definitely opened me up to that. Along that path I got kind of initiated into some of the Lakota traditions of doing a lot of sweat lodges, pipe ceremonies. That kind of, I had a close brother of mine that used to lead those, and that was a big part of my path for a long time. Still is when it's available. And there's a way that we can, in a ceremonial sense, invoke things that typically us people that grow up in this kind of disconnected way from nature, from our own bodies, from this kind of relational way of being, um, we can invoke that through ceremony, through ritual. And part of my own rites of passage in my early 20s when I was initiated in a kind of masculine tradition that was rooted in actually like West African indigenous culture. It was through a lineage from a man that was actually a psychotherapist that studied with somebody by the name of Malidoma Somé, who some people know of him. He does a lot of work around like grief ritual and those kinds of things. And but that that rite of passage experience was largely rooted in like what is our relationship to nature and how can we use nature to open us up to a a quality of being with like both the seen elemental forces but also the unseen, like the things that it's hard to put these things into words, but there's a way that nature kind of informs us. There's an intelligence to this natural world that is recognized in many indigenous traditions around the world. Like there's a wisdom, it communicates to us if we really listen. And personally, I think the masculinity that needs to be taught, and I think is still absent from a lot of men's work. I'd see this kind of resurgence of men's work, and there's still a lot of like kind of bravado and needing to kind of fit into these archetypes that are still largely divorced from this relational way of being that to me represents an emotionally mature version of masculinity. There's an awareness of subtlety. There's an awareness of how do we really learn how to listen on all levels, and that practice carries forward into our intimate relationships on the deepest level.
Yeah, what you were just speaking to, just in regards to the men's work that you see today, there's quite a big range of what we see in men's work, but I do see a lot of that, like you said, that like bravado. You've got to fit into this is what masculinity looks like, this is what these are sort of the ways that we approach it. And I do see a lot of pushing and challenges, which I think is really important, that there's so
Mhm.
much beauty in here's a challenge, here is an initiation to move through. I think especially today when a lot of life is physically easy in certain ways, like
Yeah.
there we have technology to help us with a lot of things, but then emotionally very disconnected in certain ways. And I think that those challenges and those initiations are so deeply important for that need to go through the fire, that need to pass through initiations in order to move through life in a way that actually is connected to nature and to our own natural, the cycles of life, and
Hmm.
these challenges that we need to go through in order to move through the world in a way that feels satisfying and true for us. And something that you talk about some is the simultaneous importance of challenge and of those initiations and of I don't know if you want to say struggle, but really of these challenging aspects of life and pushing yourself, pushing each other, and then
Hmm.
simultaneously how important it is to have safety. And I'm curious to hear from you why you think it is so important for men to have both safety and challenge to grow and to heal, particularly today.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. So, um, yeah, before I fully respond to that, I just kind of want to respond a little bit to what you shared because I agree 100% that we've become kind of docile as a culture. Men have become pretty domesticated, and we've kind of leaned too far in the direction of being comfortable, right? And so yeah, there is something that bringing challenge to a certain subsector of men is really essential to kind of activate something in them, right? Sometimes though, because of our egoic nature as men, like that, we can kind of muscle our way through things, right? And we can kind of access that challenge not from a place of depth, but from a place of like proving oneself from like an orientation of, inadequacy, which kind of can tend to reinforce the story that's already there for a lot of men. So that's where I personally like to challenge just some of the, like, let's do more cold plunges kind of men's work, and that's the thing that we need to do. um, and I love cold plunges, and I think it's good, right? But it's not all of it. Speaking to the need for safety and challenge, right? This is it's kind of a paradoxical thing, right? Because if we lean too far into like safety and we have all these like perfect conditions, um, we're never going to kind of face the things that we need to face in our lives in order to grow. Um, However, we need enough safety that our nervous system can kind of relax open into a new way of being. I think what's different from like a modern day initiation from say let's say like a traditional cultural initiation where they literally had to face death, right? um, in many traditions, right? Go through very painful, difficult, harrowing experiences, which we can't really get away with these days, in most cases, unless we're self-initiating.
Right.
um,
Hazing isn't really
yeah,
supported
circumcising each other, uh,
that.
so what's missing from modern culture, and why a lot of these try to replicas of initiation fall short is because most of us grew up in environments where our caregivers insufficiently provided for what we needed, right? And so there's already kind of this deficiency. Whereas if we were in some kind of intact tribe with these kind of generational dynamics of relationship, like our attachment systems would be a lot healthier.
Right.
Uh, and so, this expectation that we can just take a modern man through, like, just to go sit out in the woods for 3 days, which is great. And something can open up from that space of challenge and just, opening up to greater forces in nature and in the universe that can nurture us and support us. However, I think what I see for a lot of men is like we need to actually go into those places of our past and do that kind of inner child work that is somewhat tedious, to kind of reparent our own nervous system, and in order to just grow up to kind of a decent adolescent level way of being, like
Yeah.
I belong here, like I'm good enough as I am, I'm lovable, right? All these really basic things that we should have gotten growing up.
And I would ask another question further, which is, in your eyes, what happens if you don't do that? What happens on an individual and a collective sort of societal level if you have a whole generation of men, of people not doing that?
Yeah, I mean, we see it. I've seen it in my own life. Just that there's a way that these relational wounds left unrepaired and unhealed will just kind of wreak havoc on
Yeah.
our adult relationships. It turns into abusive, toxic relationship dynamics. It turns into men that are emotionally stunted, that are stepping into leadership positions in the world, and they're self-serving, right? And their um, lack of relational awareness and unmet childhood needs are end up taking the driver's seat of their life. So everything that a man does from that place of there's something empty in me that I'm trying to fill, um, becomes his unconscious operating system that causes him to just abuse life, right? Like come from this place of scarcity and consumption and almost like a vampiric way of being,
Right.
to put it kind of harshly.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with this dichotomy of safety and challenge, one of the most important things is for us to have safety, not just on a physical level, but on a relational level, for us to have the safety of, I know that I have people there for me. I know that I'm loved and accepted. I know that I not only can fend for myself in terms of my own basic survival needs, but there are people around me who are also supporting me in that way. And you go back a couple hundred years, and I think that that was much more the norm than it is today, actually, in many cases, where today you see so many people struggling with loneliness, struggling with, I don't have anyone to turn to, struggling
Hmm.
with, who do I look to as a good example? Who do I go to when I'm feeling emotionally unstable or when I'm just having a really hard time? And so many men, particularly, are deeply longing for that and don't have that relational safety in a big way in their lives. And the more that that can be cultivated both internally and on a sort of communal level, right? I think within self work, it's like we create safety internally, and that is what allows the safety to reveal itself around us. So in a way, it's an inside job. And I think with any healing, with any development of safety, it also is we're relational beings, and so it happens when we create those bonds and those really deep familiar connections that allow us to feel safe in our being. And
Hmm.
then when we have that emotional safety, when we have that, like, I'm okay, I've got people around me, I've got what it is that I need relationally, internally, on the physical plane as well, then the challenges, it's almost like those challenges have somewhere to land. Like the safety gives the energy and the motivation and the inspiration to be able to move through those challenges in a really healthy way, as opposed to, I need to just do this challenge so that I'm good enough to have the safety, the
Hmm.
love, the acceptance that I need.
Yeah, 100%. Totally agree. There's, it's like if we look at kind of the archetypal father and mother imprint, the mother is that kind of safe space energetically, right? And the father's role is to kind of challenge and push a child out into the world. And if we didn't have that growing up, we have to replicate it. And I actually really believe that we can work on creating that ourselves, but it's actually quite difficult if we don't have that imprint, right? So I actually strongly advocate for men to invest in spaces where they can receive that almost as like a transmission into their nervous system. Like if our nervous system doesn't know what that feels like, it's not going to really be able to just generate it out of nowhere, right? So that's why we need mentorship. That's why we
Yeah,
need community spaces. And the cool thing about a men's community in many ways is it's not just one nervous system that's holding a man, right? There's a whole collective field that gets created that's much more robust,
yeah,
and that's the potential that's available, right? Like the level of containment and container. And I'm not saying all men's groups have safe containers. I think there's probably a lot of sloppy stuff out there, just like we see that in the plant medicine world and all that kind of stuff. So that healthy container, which really needs to be taught. I had to learn how to do it. I had to learn it not just through transmission, but actually through instruction of what it means to create that kind of container so that somebody can really open up and go into the deep, dark parts of themselves and learn and grow and heal. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think so much of today's self work is like reparent ourselves, help ourselves get our own needs met. And it's so beautiful to be able to do that. It is so important to be able to go in and take care of our little one, take care of the parts of us.
Hmm.
And it can't stop there. It also has to be relational. And I think it also shouldn't all have to come from one person. Like it doesn't, really make sense for us to get all of our needs met from our mother and our father if we grew up with mother and father, or if we didn't grow up with mother and father. It, as a species, I think it makes so much more sense for us to be getting our needs met from, like you said, a robust community, which can absolutely be repatterned. There's that saying, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, which there's a lot to be said about that.
Yeah.
But this idea that, like, we can create that type of community, it requires us to do our inner work with ourselves. We can't only depend on that community, but when we have that, so much is, so many of our connection wounds and the
Hmm.
missing pieces where we didn't have a mentor, where we didn't have somebody to look up to, can actually be filled by being willing and devoted to participating in a robust community.
Hmm. Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
one thing that I'm incredibly grateful for from my childhood. When I was about 7 years old, we moved into a co-housing community,
Oh,
and
wow.
so I was surrounded by other adults, and
Hmm.
I could go and hang out with. They were all, not all of them, but a lot of them were like aunts and uncles. And if I was,
Hmm.
mad at my parents, I could go over to the
Hmm.
neighbors and be held there. And I'm incredibly, incredibly grateful for having that, and for having, I think a big reason why we moved there was so I could be around other kids,
Hmm.
which, yes, was so incredibly beautiful for the way that I grew up in terms of creating community and relational dynamics. But what truly impacted me from that was, I can turn to many people. I don't need to get everything from one or two people, which the sort of nuclear family structure tends to be like, well, you get it in the home, and if you don't, it's pretty hard to find it elsewhere.
Hmm.
So, especially I think today, when there's a lot more usage of technology, there's not as much of the street party, block party kind of
Hmm.
way of growing up, that I think is actually so, so important for us to pay extra attention to cultivating for ourselves and for our children.
100%. My daughter's 18 now, but when she was growing up, it was such a stark contrast in like some of the different living situations that I found myself in with her, in terms of like there was when it was just me, single dad at home with my daughter versus, when I lived on a property with a couple other families and with kids around the same age, and just the shift in dynamic of like what kids need to be stimulated, right, in their expression and imagination. Like we can't provide that for our children as parents. It's actually totally unnatural. That's why so many parents like stick their kids in front of iPads, because it's just, you know it's hard, right? Like we're not meant to play on that level as adults, maybe for bits of time, right? So yeah, it you know I really, and this is kind of part of my vision of like the new paradigm of humanity. It's not just masculinity, but like how do we move more towards this as a culture?
Mm.
Because I think there's so many missing pieces, and this ties, like you said, back into our biology. Like literally, we evolved to be in the kind of multiplicity of relationships, and the coupledom experience, like as beautiful as it can be, when we don't have those outside reflections, we end up kind of in these dynamics where we devour each other as couples, right? We kind of
Yeah.
expect too much from one person, and it's just not healthy in my
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How do you feel, and it's been 18 years, it's been a long time, but how do you feel like being a father and having the awareness that you are the primary masculine figure in someone's life? How did that what are some of the main ways that you saw that shift your path as a man when you became a father?
I mean, I remember the day my daughter was born, and it was such a like beautiful, joyous moment for me, and
Mm.
something just activated in me around um, just, yeah, there was this like primal aliveness that came through me of, this protector energy, this provider energy, responsibility as a parent to create a safe space for my daughter, right, in the world, in a world that even at that time, I was, I think, 26 when my daughter was born. So pretty young for today's standards. But yeah, I was pretty aware at that age that, like, this is the world I was bringing my daughter into, but not really the world that I wanted to, that there
Yeah.
was something about the world that I felt needed to change. And,
Mm.
I think what's different now from my mindset in my early 20s is like a lot of my orientation was outwardly focused, where, like, there's all the problems are out there. But I think, through my relationship challenges, realized that, like, actually most of the stuff is inside of me that I need to deal with.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be way more equipped to create the out there reflection of, a healthy world when I'm healthy and whole as an
Yeah.
individual.
Yeah.
And that's, that's the primary responsibility that I hold as a father, is to,
Mm.
um, yeah, just, it's not just about, like, providing for her on this, like, physical level, but providership in terms of the level of presence and
Yeah.
attunement that I can bring to her, even, even at this age, right? Like, she's at a different stage of development, and, her brain is still developing. And I know that how I show up now shapes her for the rest of her life.
Completely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are in many ways the template for what she then, for her standards for herself in relationship, and also the template for what the ways that she wants to love and be loved by men in her life, whether that is whatever kind of dynamic that's in, the way that, as you know, I can speak as myself, the way that a father teaches us about love, about presence, about care for each other, about respect, really dictates the template that we have for our approach to men throughout life. And I'm curious, as she's gotten older, what has your approach been in terms of talking to her about men, if that's been a thing for you? What has been your approach to sort of how you share with her in the context of her relationship to men in general in this world?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a unique situation, in terms of what I've had to experience being in, kind of a difficult co-parenting dynamic with her mother, for a lot of the years. And, my experience was, I attracted somebody into my life that sort of had not a very positive masculine imprint,
Yeah.
and so, a lot of the stuff that came up in a relationship, while some of it, landed as things I needed to take ownership of, there was also a lot of projection that was there of, like, her unhealed wounds. And so, you know, having my daughter grow up in that environment, and have, her mother being a large influence, it's been it's been a little tricky
Mm.
to kind of sidestep the projections and still show up as the father that I want to be, and not, like, take those things on. And I've had to do a lot of healing around my own shame and the things in me that kind of attracted that dynamic, um, so that, I could embody my truth, and just, be steady and consistent in that.
Mm.
And so, for me, it's not so much about conversations I've needed to have with my daughter about how men are. It's more about what is the example that I'm setting by my way of being. So,
Right.
I think sometimes when we communicate to the mind, right, especially if it's challenging one's perceptions, which I think was present in our dynamic, there can be a lot of resistance, to, trying to paint a different picture, so to speak. So, Yeah, my practice has just been like, how do I need to show up here for her? What does she need?
All right.
And yeah.
And I love that you brought in like that it's dealing with projections, it's also dealing with shame, it's dealing with the shadow. It's like your way of being a positive example for her is to show her is to be real with your own process around, okay, here's the impact that that projection has on me. Here are the parts of myself that I have to look at and work with. It's not to be a perfect image of a man, perfect image of the ideal father. It's to lean into those edges, to lean in and actually do the shadow work around, here's the shame, here's the projection, here's the self, whatever it is. And I think that truly is, as men, as women, as everybody, how we can really teach our children how to approach when we bring them into a world where we wish things were different, to show them here's what it looks like to lean into the discomfort and to actually work with what's real in our own experience, and to not need to be a perfect example, but to rather show what it looks like to work when things aren't perfect and when things are actually deeply confronting and challenging.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And yeah, and I think the age appropriateness of what's revealed in that process too is an important component, right? And so like developmentally, yeah, I feel like she's at an age right now where she has a little more capacity for like understanding my experience. And
Yeah.
um, but in the past, certain things need to be contained, right, and just felt and transmitted through how I'm showing up. And
Yeah.
I think, I imagine as she gets older, like that understanding will come through on some level, right? How
Yeah.
what she's perhaps learned from me, and
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. That's one of the most beautiful things about, I think, the parent child dynamic is the ways that we perceive each other and learn from each other and grow with each other as time goes on. And
Hmm.
with my parents, there's such a beautiful continuous reflection of how we can continue to take care of each other, reflect each other, support each other as our understandings of each other grow, and as whatever's age appropriate for that process. It's such an incredibly beautiful sandbox to understand ourselves and to do that deeper work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's not easy. Like we don't really get a manual for parenting,
Yeah. Yeah.
so like we can do our best. But I feel like for myself, the more I've integrated and found my own wholeness, parenting comes pretty natural, right? Like, yeah, it's nice to have some tips and tools and stuff along the way. It'd be great if somebody printed that out at some point. But um,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. So I've got another question for you, which is around this conversation around masculinity. We often see people referring to masculinity in relationship to men, and then femininity in relationship to women. And I talk about this all the time, that we have both within us, that it's like right and left hand, right? That one tends to be dominant, but we function best when we're deeply in touch with both, when we're in relationship to both internally and externally. And I'm curious, within the context of your work, can you talk a bit about a man's relationship to the feminine as a reflection of his unconscious, and the
Uh,
ways also that his relationship to women externally will then mirror his relationship to those parts of himself?
yeah, yeah. So it's not so cut and dry like this, but sometimes it's helpful to create these kind of understanding in terms of like systems and structures, right? So if we
Mhm.
look at the feminine energetics and what that represents, for a lot of men that can mean their emotional experience, what's happening in their bodies. So kind of from a more like a tantric lens, that the feminine is kind of considered all phenomena of life, right? It's like everything that is in existence in this like physical form. And on the other end of that spectrum, from that perspective, is like the masculine is like the kind of like the empty space or the container for life to happen within.
I like to think of
And
it as like the riverbed.
yeah, yeah, it's another beautiful metaphor, right? It's like the water and the structure from like also just throwing in like a Western psychological like Jungian perspective. A man's work in juxtaposition to a woman's work is like a man's work is to actually like connect with his inner feminine, right? To drop into that unconscious part of himself and come into relationship with it in a way that there's not some adverse reaction to it.
Mm,
And particularly how we're raised in this Western culture as men, we tend to be conditioned around like um, anything that's like unknown, uncertain, out of control, chaotic, mysterious, changeable. Uh, we feel really uncomfortable with it, right? And so that, you know, for a lot of men, that is their emotional experience. And when we start to cultivate um, intimacy with our emotional experience, and that happens on different levels, but fundamentally it's about like, can we be present with it? Can we meet it? Can we say yes to it without making it wrong or bad? um, we then get into a relationship where those emotions can start to flow naturally, right? We don't need to suppress them or control them. And and then, the natural essence of our being as a human, beyond like gender identity, gets to come through, right?
mm,
It's not so much about like men need to be this way. It's more like we all are who we are, right? Made up of this, these different compositions of different elements, and we'll never be able to quantify all of them exactly, right?
mm.
And so this is also where I challenge a little bit of some of the modern like masculinity perspective, because it becomes sort of like dogmatic in a way. And I really believe the fundamental nature of who we are is kind of never going to change. And the only thing that changes it is us trying to adapt ourselves to be loved and accepted by the world, right? So part of our work as men is to um, slow down enough that we can allow that authentic truth of our being to start to come through, to make space for it, to stop shutting it down. And when we're able to do that, something really beautiful emerges, right? Like this, um, yeah, there's a way of being that becomes less kind of contorted to fit into who we think we should be, and we get to start to be ourselves more fully, and there's a freedom in that. And in doing so, like the more we give permission for the truth of our being to come through,
Right.
um, we're actually cultivating that capacity to be in relationship to a woman um, without trying to control her, without trying to fix her, without trying to suppress her, without trying to have her fit our selfish needs, right? And we can allow for her true expression to come through.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, in a way that's what a lot of men truly crave, but they're afraid of, right?
Mm,
Just like they're afraid of their own unconscious self.
absolutely. Yeah, the word that keeps coming up as you're sharing is just reverence. Reverence for the feminine, both internally and externally. Reverence for life in all of its chaos and all of its beauty and all of its unknown, in all of its movement, and the the respect and reverence for the movement of life in that way. The respect and reverence for men's own inner intuition, knowing, energy, all of the the chaos of it when it's approached with when the uncontrollable and unknown is approached with that reverence, it mirrors both internally and externally in such a beautiful way.
yeah, it creates a space where we can actually receive the gifts and the nourishment from the feminine, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, I think a lot of men can connect to that a little bit more, like going out into nature, right? It's a little easier to like receive in that way.
Yeah.
Um, but it's, like in a lot of indigenous traditions, nature is the mother, right? And that is the great feminine. And um, yeah, and it's a little scary and uncomfortable at times, right? If you go sit out in the forest for 3 nights without food.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's again, it's that like uncontrollable wildness of
Hmm.
life
Yeah.
that is also it's like any of us, it's like our emotions, our perceptions, our experience of life in many ways is, and this is a whole conversation to dissect, well, what does masculine mean, what does feminine mean, but I see it as the feminine is almost like the parts of us that absorb information, the parts of us that know what it is that we want, the parts of us that desire, the parts of us that feel and engage. And the
Hmm.
feminine, the internal feminine informs our masculine. It shapes our masculine. And so they're in this constant play
Hmm.
with one another. And when feminine, quote unquote, feminine qualities are pushed away or cut out, it creates this kind of, it's like the inner world doesn't have it's like half is missing. And
Hmm.
I think the more that we can find this acceptance of the inner world and the inner union that's happening internally, the more we can actually move and function as whole human beings. And I think there tends to be a lot of dogma around, well, you should be like this. And if you're a masculine man, you should be like this, as opposed to find your own inner relationship. And you can still be primarily, dominantly masculine, but without this reaction or resistance to what is deemed feminine. And something I see is that a lot of men are taught how to not be a woman. It's like to be a man, you have to not do all of these
Right.
things. You have to not feel your feelings too much. You have to not be reactive. You have to, and when it's instead, here's how you can, as a man, in whatever expression of man you are, here's how you can actually work with those qualities to be the most holistic version of yourself without this dogmatic, here's what I should be and here's what I shouldn't be.
Yeah. Yeah. And, this isn't to say that men can't cultivate their masculine too, right? I think
Absolutely.
that's necessary for a lot of men because they've, that part of them has been put into the shadow for whatever reason. I had to work on that very intentionally because, I grew up in a household where, it was like, very feminist culture, like, men are the problems of the world, like, kind of somewhat emasculated by my mother. And so, for me to lean into the aspects of me that were, more aggressive, more confrontational, more, um, just able to kind of be in physical stillness and not need anything, right? All these aspects I've had to intentionally work on. And when I've done that, I discovered like how good they feel, right? Like that I'd been kind of disconnected from them. I'd been told that there was a problem there. And so, it's taken me many years to be able to like rest in those parts of myself and learn how to embody that in relationships without shame. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like when there's resistance to the inner feminine, it actually weakens the inner masculine in an interesting way. If we're resisting emotion or intensity, then that those masculine qualities actually can diminish and dissipate some, and the the positive relationship to both and finding your natural within it and really cultivating, like you said, cultivating your masculine without rejecting your feminine
Yeah.
is so, so, so deeply important.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I just want to speak to what you're sharing. Like there is, because of that law of polarity that exists, like our willingness to actually go into our own feminine experience intentionally, like consciously, not just like, in the unconscious ways that a lot of men will be in their feminine, but to actually like, oh, what's it like to really feel my sensuality and drop into this like physical emotive expression, um, that will naturally evoke the part of us that can actually hold that, right? Like the quality of presence that's needed for that to come through, will show up in that space. It's kind of like this vacuum effect. So in a way, it sort of, like you said, it kind of activates the internal masculine that's already there and available.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love that way of putting it. It creates that vacuum effect. It's like it energetically does its own thing
Mm-hmm.
internally and externally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, I love the context in which you see all of this. It's really beautiful to hear the way that your mind works. And I'm curious for anybody who is wants to know more about what it is that you do or wants to work with you. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is that you do out there in the world and how people can find you and work with you?
Sure. Yeah. I do both one-on-one work and group work, and I am putting together a group program here in the near future, which is called the Reset, and it's kind of like the conglomeration of some of the most powerful tools I've experienced and encountered in my 2 decades of doing men's work, and the foundation of it is um, quite a challenging practice. Talking about challenges, so it's actually doing a what some might call a feminine cleanse. So it's actually, in a way, stripping away all of the um, external experiences of like seeking out connection, validation, sex, dating, all that stuff with an external feminine partner, and taking all that energy that so many men expend towards that purpose and that pursuit, which is often coming from a place of where there's like a lack of wholeness in oneself. Just really touching on what we're speaking to, where we kind of project our own feminine out there in the world, and we try to kind of get those needs met externally, which results in a way like a quality of neediness. So it's bringing all that energy in, taking those things off the table for a period of 12 weeks, and just focusing on a lot of different practices that we've talked about, like getting into the body, feeling one's emotions, kind of coming into emotional integrity, um, and learning how to work with our sexual energy in a way that it's, again, not giving it away. There's a way that we can, men can get into these cycles of giving their power away to women, and it creates this, um, not only like a dependence, but a kind of a subtle disempowerment. So it is a way for men to come fully into their power, connect to why they're here in the deepest possible way, and also build those robust relationships with other men. Yeah.
Beautiful. Such important, beautiful work.
Hmm.
So how can men find you?
They can find me. I'm primarily active on Instagram, so I'm on there at the the.essential.man is my Instagram handle. Um, the my website is theessentialman.net, and yeah, check it out.
Beautiful. And we will link all of that in the show notes as well.
Great.
Thank you so much, Soma. I so appreciate the work that you're doing in this world, your approach to it, your self inquiry through the whole process. Thank you for this beautiful conversation. It's been so great to chat with you
Yeah.
and hear you and feel you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.